Good. So I just titled this Living with Fire in the North Bay Area. How did we get here? What's happening? And what can we do? Obviously, those are three gigantic questions. I can't answer any of them in 30 minutes, but we'll just do a pretty quick overview of those topics. So what I wanted to talk about with all of you was give you just to start with kind of a broad, quick overview of fire's role in our landscape, typical local fire ecology, what our native fire regimes look like, and what are some of the impediments to restoring those. Some of the observations that I've made and that others have made with regards to recent fires in our region, and then talking about how we can enhance community safety and how we can enhance forest and ecosystem health in anticipation of wildfire. And touching on what Tony was saying in his introduction, that I've very intentionally broken these two things out because my impression talking with the public is that the Venn diagram overlap between those two things is almost entire. To my mind, they are very separate, and you can have co-benefits where addressing one can provide some benefits to the other. But in my mind, they're very separate objectives, and there's a very different suite of strategies that we use to do both of those things. Next slide. Oh, it turned my image on its side. That's interesting. Fire doesn't usually burn vertically across the landscape like that. So speaking to fire's role in our landscape, I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with the concept of a fire regime. When we talk about a fire regime, that is a generalization about fire's typical presence on a landscape. Often we're talking about what fire has done on a landscape prior to about the mid-1800s. And our understanding of what a fire regime is usually based on an agglomeration of information and data. It can be conversations with indigenous communities who've been on the land for a very long time and been directly involved in stewarding and perpetuating those fire regimes, tree ring research data, sediment coring data, fire scar sampling have all been used to great effect to try and recreate the story of fire on a landscape. Fire regimes encompass factors like what we call fire return interval, which is a technical term for simply the average amount of time between fires on a particular point in the land or a particular vegetation type. I always like to emphasize that that's an average. So if we're looking at fire return intervals as a guide for how often we want to burn a landscape, it doesn't mean it needs to burn every 20 years like clockwork. It's just an average, and we might want to hit somewhere in there. Fire regimes also contemplate fire intensity. Have the fires tended to be very hot? Have they tended to be relatively cool? What kind of mortality have they tended to cause? Are they stand replacing? Are they low intensity ground fires that don't really influence woody vegetation too much? And then also the spatial extent of those fires. Have they been large on the landscape? Have they been small? If so, what has limited them? We do know that in California, prior to the period of fire suppression in the 20th century and in the 19th century, fires tended to limit the spread of subsequent fires. So you had footprints on the landscape that had recently burned. Fires that came in the year or the years following would tend to stop at those boundaries. So that pattern of fire across the landscape limited how large any of those fires tended to get. I tend to talk a lot in my outings and my presentations and my interactions with the public about positive fire effects. Obviously, the fires that Sonoma County in particular has experienced since 2017 have been incredibly traumatic for our community. People have lost their lives. People have lost their homes. Even people who haven't been directly affected with losses have gone through, in some cases, unimaginable stress and trauma. And I never want to gloss over that or make light of it in any way with my, my kind of enthusiasm for prescribed fire or for fire as an ecosystem process. But I have found that it has been very, it's been a source of solace for people and comfort to be able to be out on the land post-fire and to talk about what's happening and to understand that among our many worries and among our many fire-related worries, we typically don't really need to worry too much about what's happening in wild places and on natural lands after fire, that there are all kinds of wonderful things that the fire has done and that we can kind of take heart in that. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of positive fire effects up here. I just listed a few that are typical and that we talk about a lot. One of the really dominant ones is fire's role in enhancing diversity on a landscape. And that has to do both with biodiversity and with structure diversity and habitat diversity. As if you have an undisturbed landscape, if you have a landscape that fire has been excluded from for many decades, there's a natural progression with vegetation succession towards more and more shade tolerant species and less diversity in that system. So typically, as we all see around here, in the absence of fire, landscapes tend to shift towards dominance by Douglas fir and by California bay laurel, two very shade tolerant species that can really effectively outcompete other trees, as well as shade out the forest floor so completely that hardly anything grows on it. If you then transition away from a landscape that is a mosaic of different kinds of grasslands, different kinds of chaparral, oak woodland, oak savanna, different types of hardwood forest assemblages, and conifer forest toward just conifer forest dominated by Douglas fir, obviously you're losing that biodiversity, you're losing that habitat diversity, and you're also losing the resilience in that area to extreme events like wildfire and like climate change. It's just as with agriculture, if you have a monoculture, then if you have a disease or you have some type of factor that is going to negatively impact that dominant species, suddenly it's wiped out, you have mass mortality and there's nothing left, or there's very little left. So it's just kind of a rule of thumb that the more diverse an ecosystem is, typically, the more resilient it's going to be, the more different species will be present to be able to take advantage of change conditions and keep those landscapes really viable and keep them healthy. I think, as we probably all know, there are many species of plants in our region that are dependent on fire for seed release and for seed germination. That can be really critical in supporting some rare and endangered species. We have chaparral species, we have little wildflowers that have been really enhanced by recent fires. Of course, fires, appropriate fires, can support indigenous practices, harvesting, gathering, supporting the conditions that are necessary for various cultural practices. Fire plays a huge role in nutrient cycling and getting nutrients back into the soil. Obviously, when you burn something, some things are lost as smoke, but there was something that was really graphic that I wish that I had been able to get a photo of this spring after the glass fire at our Saddle Mountain Preserve, where we had areas in the grasslands where there had been large diameter woody stuff, you know, a log or maybe a pile of woody material that had burned, and had burned very hot. So right in the exact footprint of that material, you had a little spot where the soil had been sterilized and there was nothing growing there. But then in a kind of a halo effect, all around that little scar on the landscape was this huge flush of really, really lush green vegetative growth, where the nutrients in that ash, once you got away from the intense heat of that long smoldering material, had just provided this massive fertilizer boost. And then that, of course, then like petered out as you got farther away from that spot. So it was really interesting to see. Fires can play a role in checking the prevalence and spread of various diseases on the landscape. And as I mentioned, they can limit the spread of subsequent wildfires. I say that with a big fat caveat. I don't like to generalize too much about that. There are instances where a fire can actually enhance the spread of subsequent wildfires. If you have areas where non-native annual species come in after a fire and fill in ground that might have been otherwise bare, you can have a very flashy, very receptive fuel bed that can carry fire through an area that might not have supported it before it was burned or before it was disturbed. So chaparral is kind of a key example of that. If you disturb a chaparral area and you get a lot of invasive grasses that come in, that area can carry fire much more frequently than it would have absent those non-native species. So that's kind of that's my caveat on the limit of spread, but that is an effect that you can see. Next slide. Well, that one's right side up. So then talking about how this has changed over time and why, the most really tragic reason why this has ceased over time is, of course, because our region here in Sonoma County and also throughout the West the fire regimes in our area largely were driven in some areas by lightning, but in many areas by intentional burning by indigenous people, by what we call anthropogenic burning. The cessation of that in the 1800s as indigenous people lost their lands and were disallowed from continuing those practices has had a massive effect on changes in fuels and vegetation and just the characteristics of the landscape. Also, after 1910, the Forest Service took on a policy of almost total, well, attempted total fire suppression. The photo that I included on this slide are firefighters in Montana in 1910. Probably a lot of you have heard of what they called the Big Burn. There was a suite of massive wildfires that affected the American West. At that time, there was a lot of loss of life, loss of towns. And so that was really the genesis of our federal policy of attempting to suppress every wildfire. And that's a whole other conversation that we could have about the pros and cons of that policy. But an obvious con has been that we then now today find ourselves in the position of lands that have had fire excluded for many, many decades and have unhealthy buildups of fuel and species compositional shifts that have started to cause those systems to fall apart. And then, of course, another problem, or not necessarily a problem, but another thing that has changed over time is that populations have increased, towns have increased and sprawled out into wildland-urban interface or WUI areas. So we have increased development in areas that were originally just wildlands. Next slide. So then what has been the result of this change? One very obvious one on the land is that we have unimpeded vegetation succession. So this photograph was taken on our Saddle Mountain Preserve about 10 years ago, so prior to the glass fire. That particular spot, the preserve had not burned for at least 100 years before the glass fire. So really pretty complete fire exclusion in that area. It had been logged sometime during that 100 years, but it had been a long time. There'd been no active forest management. And so succession had really been allowed to run through its whole cycle across the preserve. And that's true in our region, across Sonoma County and the North Bay area in general. What you're seeing in that photo is very dense Douglas fir sapling intrusion into an area that's already becoming dominated by larger Douglas firs that are about 60, 70 years old, in an area that also has extremely large, old black oaks and big leaf maple and some other hardwoods. So you see the whole shift in that area from a hardwood forest to a conifer dominated forest to a conifer forest that's starting to have this insane level of ladder fuels and sort of lower level woody fuel availability. So that's driven large scale habitat transitions and at this, again, that tendency for Douglas fir dominance across really large areas of landscape that were primarily before this a mosaic of grasslands and other vegetation types. And then, of course, with the increased development in the WUI areas, we have more people than ever living in really high risk areas, living in areas with extreme fire danger, in homes that were not built to any, contemporary or modern codes for fire safety. They may only have one way out and are in a really bad position when wildfire does come into those lands. Next slide. So ideally we could just restore a native fire regime. And by native fire regime, I'm talking about, the fire regimes that existed in our area pre-1900s. There are obviously many impediments to being able to do that wholesale across our landscape. These are just a few of them. We have invasive species now. We did not have them hundreds of years ago. So we have considerations around reintroducing fire into areas and then having invasive species make use of those disturbed areas. They can be more invasible in their recently disturbed state. If you have invasive species present on a landscape and you burn it, depending on which species, some of them can very opportunistically really explode in numbers. Yellow star thistle is notorious for doing this. French broom is as well. So that's something that you need to factor in if you're planning a prescribed burn, is taking a look at what invasives you have and being proactive about how you're going to manage those after the fire. The kind of silver lining of that is that if you burn some of these species that are really aggressively flushed into germination after a fire, you've effectively exhausted the seed bank at that point. So if you do go in and aggressively control those species after a fire, that can be a great opportunity to really get the upper hand with some of those species. But it does make the whole process rather more complicated, as does climate change. Climate change is a whole other can of worms, of course. Looking to the past, looking to many centuries ago as a template for how we want the landscape to look is confounded by the fact that we have considerations now around needing to maximize carbon sequestration potential on lands, having areas that are perhaps due to changing rainfall patterns or changing temperature going to be less productive habitat for the species that have traditionally grown on them. So that's, yeah, that just makes it incredibly complicated, just in land management and stewardship in general, but with fire in trying to be proactive and think about how the landscape may need to shift and how we incorporate that into our thinking. Habitat fragmentation and WUI considerations really are kind of part of the same issue, where we have roads, we have infrastructure, we have residences, we have telecommunications things out in the wildlands now. There are all kinds of there's all kinds of stuff out there now that we don't want to burn up, and so simply imposing what we think would be the appropriate footprint for a burned area on the landscape is probably going to have to be significantly scaled back, just to protect some of those other features on the landscape. And then, of course, air quality is a major consideration. Ideally, when you are doing a prescribed burn, of course, you are burning under a prescription that includes specifics around wind speed, wind direction, smoke transport, fuel moistures that's going to influence not just fire behavior, but what your smoke output is. And so optimally, ideally with a prescribed burn, you are getting less smoke and you are choosing where that smoke goes, which is a better scenario than simply waiting for wildfire to overrun a place and then having to take whatever's thrown at you at that point. But of course, any kind of burning does produce smoke. And if you are doing a burn in a grassland area, that smoke can be extremely short-lived. It can dissipate within minutes. But if you're burning in timber, which is something that I think land managers across our region are all agreeing we need to be doing more of, it can take days and weeks for that material to burn down, and smoke output is going to be a factor for that entire period of time. And CAL FIRE and the Air District are going to have some opinions about that and are likely going to tell you what you're going to need to do in terms of mopping up the degree to which you can allow things to burn down naturally. Excuse me. So that's just another thing that you have to kind of weigh. Obviously, if you can let material burn down on its own, you're going to get closer to your objectives for fuel reduction. That woody material will actually be consumed. It's just a more natural process to let that process play out. Whereas if you go in and you have to aggressively mop up and you have to put water on things, you might cut your smoke event shorter, but you are going to be left with more material on the ground that you might have been hoping to get rid of. You might also be disturbing that site more than you might want to with tools, with water, with vehicles. So yeah, air quality winds up being a big kind of confounding influence on timber burns. And just to explain my photos, that one is actually from Kings Canyon National Park. That was a springtime timber burn that we did. It looks rather dramatic, but it was actually pretty mellow in there. So next slide. So I listed 4 recent wildfires or fire complexes on here. This is a little bit of an arbitrary bracketing of some of the recent events that we've had. Obviously, prior to 2017, Lake County was dealing with really impactful wildfires. 2018, which I've not included in the list, was the most destructive fire season the state of California has seen. Terrible loss of life and the impacts to the communities from the Camp Fire. So there have been others, but I just listed these 4 as being very specific to our region. And they're also the 4 where I've been on the ground a lot, with the 2017 Sonoma Complex fires, the Kincaid fire in 2019, the LNU lightning complex from last year that was triggered by that lightning event that we had in September. I believe that was in September. and then the late September, early October glass fire. The photo in the background there is a picture I took right immediately after the glass fire on Saddle Mountain. And it kind of shows an interesting array of immediate fire effects that kind of break out in terms of species. So you see the grassland being, of course, completely burned, as would be typical, the coyote brush in that area being very scorched, and then really pretty light fire effects in the live oak woodland that's beyond that. And then what's obviously going to be heavier mortality in the Douglas fir beyond. And I realized I didn't mention on an earlier slide, but when I was talking about Douglas fir dominance across a landscape, you know, there are multiple reasons why we might not want to see that on a very large scale. And one was what I was talking about with biodiversity loss, but also Douglas fir, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a species that is incredibly susceptible to being killed by wildfire, even really low intensity wildfire. It just cannot handle getting scorched. It doesn't resprout the way that coast redwoods will, and it can't shake it off the way that oaks and some of the other hardwoods can. So if you have a landscape that's dominated by Douglas fir and then you have a fire come through, you wind up with a landscape with huge numbers of dead trees, which you might not have seen if you'd had other hardwoods and a more robust sort of assemblage of species in those areas. Next slide. So what has been reassuring after these fires? And again, this is what I tend to talk to people about a lot, because people want to be reassured. People want this to be pointed out to them because they're pretty aware of what has been unpleasant with the fires. The photo that I've included here, I took in the spring at our Calabasas Creek Open Space Preserve after the 2017 Nuns Fire. The Nuns Fire, of course, was devastating to the communities around the Sonoma Valley and burned some wildlands quite hot. Calabasas, which is about 1,200 acres, burned beautifully. The fire actually was very moderate and touched this area pretty lightly. So the effects that we saw from the fire were very much on a par with what we would have wanted to see if we had done a prescribed burn. So what you're seeing in that photo is a beautiful flush of native wildflowers and native grasses in the spring following that fire. You can see that in the foreground, it's a chamise dominated chaparral stand. Every single one of those chamise plants is resprouting. You can see from the amount of material that was left by the fire in those dead skeletons that the fire wasn't really that hot. All fire is hot, of course, but a high severity fire in that environment would have taken that woody material down to the ground. So that's actually a very moderate impact from that fire. And then the lighting is a little bit hazy, so it's difficult to see what's going on in the background, but you do see there are some patches of dead Doug fir that are young that were starting to encroach on that kind of south-facing chaparral area. And then beyond that, just very patchy effects in what's kind of a mosaic of chaparral and mostly small hardwood trees. So really, you know, what we see after the fires is generally really excellent native vegetation regeneration. And in some cases, really encouraging expansions of species that are dependent on fire and dependent on disturbance. We have a number of rare species in our chaparral communities that depend on fire in order to stimulate seed production or seed drop and germination. And, you know, one just like very anecdotal example that we saw at Saddle Mountain after the glass fire, we have a critically endangered plant on that preserve called Clara Hunt's milk vetch that only occurs in 6 locations in Sonoma and Napa counties, all pretty close together. And that's, as far as we know, it for the entire planet. They were in decline due to probably a concurrent decline in disturbance in burning and grazing. It's a grassland species. It's really, really tiny little pea bean family, very beautiful little wildflower. So we had been watching numbers decline. CDFW was very concerned. And we had gotten down to, I think, 3 individuals on our preserve. After the glass fire, we went out and we counted the following spring, several hundred. The neighboring property went from several hundred to many thousands. So effects like that can be really encouraging post-fire. And of course, in places like chaparral areas, we see fire following species come in that in some cases hadn't been seen in 60 years. So there's a very long-lived seed bank, plants that are just waiting there for another opportunity to grow and to lay down seeds for their next cohort of offspring. Decreased fuel loads are, of course, very typical post-fire. Fires do a great job of burning up downed woody material. So we see forest floors in a much clearer state. That can be transitory because you can also have fire-killed material that starts to come down. So, and in some cases, you just have altered fuel loads, and that's something that we're seeing at Saddle Mountain, where the fire came through, in some cases fairly hot, in other places more moderately, and killed a lot of that encroaching Douglas fir. If you remember that slide a few slides ago where it had that really dense sapling regeneration that was going on, the fire wasn't hot enough to burn up those trees, it just killed them. If we were to get another fire at Saddle Mountain this year, I'd be very concerned about the fire effects in there. I would expect to see more extreme fire behavior because that material wasn't available to burn last year. It just was killed by scorch. It was killed by the radiant heat from the ground. But now it's dry and it's cured and it could easily catch on fire, and that could easily help transition the fire into a crown fire and could really impact the still living overstory trees and the oaks that we have out there. So the decreased fuel loads thing can be a bit of a complicated one. And then another thing that's been very reassuring that probably a lot of you have seen, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm a little scruffy here, has been that there's been a real upwelling of public support for prescribed fire. And I didn't know what to expect after the 2017 fires. I have seen in the past in my career a lot of public opposition to prescribed fire, even very, very successful prescribed burning programs. So I wasn't sure if people in general would tend to feel like, no, we've had enough of fire. We're traumatized by that. We don't want to see smoke. We don't trust people to be doing this. I'm sure there are people who feel that way, and I feel for them and feel for what they've been through. But overall, it does seem like there's really tremendous public support for prescribed burning, even in timber in the areas, which has been great to see. Next slide. So then to the opposite side of that question, what's been concerning after the fires? Of course, the impacts to individuals and to our community has been, first and foremost, incredibly damaging. Where the wildlands are concerned, we do have, as I mentioned, extensive tree mortality in those areas that had transitioned to Douglas fir dominated stands. I think that one of the most graphic examples of this that I've seen is in the upper Mark West watershed, kind of beyond Saddle Mountain, like upstream and a little bit to the north and east of there, where we had entire hillsides that had converted to Doug fir and that are now, there's not a living tree left on them. They look terrible from the road. I will say, if you've had the opportunity to go out and walk in some of those really kind of severe looking areas, there is a lot that's coming up, even with the drought. We do have seedlings from a whole suite of native trees, as well as some chaparral species and interesting forbs coming in those areas. So stuff is happening, but it's very, very tiny, and it's going to take a while for those areas to transition back into healthy forest. We have seen a lot of ladder fuel driven mortality. That's an example of it in the slide photo there. That's at Saddle Mountain, and that's a spot that really breaks my heart. We had a beautiful old specimen oak there, one of several in that area, that had been crowded in by these little Doug fir saplings that were coming up underneath the canopy. I was very acutely aware of the fuel risk to those trees, and we were planning to take those trees down right when the pandemic hit. And so we had to put that project on hold, and we were just thinking, well, it hasn't burned in 100 years. We've probably got one more season. A little delay won't hurt us. And then the glass fire came through. I can't guarantee that tree would have made it if we had managed to get all of those saplings on the ground, but I think it would have had a much stronger fighting chance. And then we have compounded stress due to the drought. And that is also something that we're seeing, in months and a year after the glass fire. We're having successive waves of tree dieback and trees that didn't appear to be that heavily impacted by the fire, and that we expected would shake it off, and that typically would, based on how that species responds to fire. And then we're starting to see more oaks die than we would have expected. And we're seeing more conifers dying. It seems to just be water stress at this point, on top of the stress that was caused by the fire. And of course, in some places we have overlapping fires. We've had fires in 2017 and 2020 and drought. And in those places, some of them are looking very stressed indeed. And then of course, invasive species response, as I mentioned, that is something that can be an issue anywhere where there are invasives previous to the fire. Also, anytime you get a dozer line, anytime you have firefighting equipment coming in, potentially from, well outside of the area, bringing seeds on their tires, we've seen a lot of yellow star thistle coming up along dozer lines and other disturbed areas and suppression impacts like that. So that has been of concern as well. Next slide. So what can we do? And this is where, as I mentioned, I like to talk about what we can do to enhance community safety as being very distinct from what we can do to protect forests and ecosystems from wildfire and other extreme events. Probably all of you are familiar with something very like the diagram that's shown on this slide, which is showing typical defensible space zones and appropriate vegetation management within those. Home hardening is one of the best things that people can do to protect homes from wildfire. And then defensible space, what's going on in the immediate home environment. Fire behavior is influenced by fuel and weather and topography. And when you have a fuel transition, fire behavior can change dramatically and very, very quickly as it transitions from one fuel type to another. So if you have fire that is burning very hot with very high flame lengths in, say, decadent chaparral, but then it gets to the end of that decadent chaparral area and transitions into grazed pasture, that fire is immediately going to come down to the ground. It's not just going to rampage across the landscape. So what people do immediately adjacent to their homes, what we do adjacent to structures and other infrastructure is really the key to what we can do to protect those things from fire. What's going on out in the forest a mile away isn't really going to translate to what the fire does by the time it gets to that person's home. And of course, we tend to think about fire's movement across the landscape in kind of modeled simplistic terms, like here it comes, it's a fire front. But of course, fire fronts leapfrog over each other. In a wind-driven fire event, we can have these ember blizzards a mile out in front of a fire. So fuel treatments aren't really going to do anything in that scenario because you have fire that's just going to blow around and over and through those areas. And so then what really is going to wind up saving the house is, what is the house made out of? Where can embers lodge? Is there stuff in the rain gutter? What's going on within those first 5 feet of that house? Ingress and egress improvement, making sure that people can get in and out of their home and their communities, that hazard trees and other hazards have been mitigated alongside those corridors, and that there are ideally more than one way out of an area where people are living, of course, is key to improving community safety. And then when it comes to fuel treatments outside of the immediate home environment and outside of the defensible space zones, what can be helpful are strategic, connected regional fuel treatments. Things like shaded fuel breaks that are located in strategic corridors along ridgetops that are aligned appropriately between the edge of a community, say, and the prevailing winds, and that connect with other things. That's not just one little piece of something sitting out there by itself in the landscape, but that actually ties into something that's going to make it functional. Fuel treatments immediately adjacent to fuel breaks like that are going to modulate fire's rate of spread and flame heights adjacent to that fuel break then can also be helpful in slowing or stopping fire spread. But most importantly, of course, are going to be helpful in allowing firefighting personnel to get into those areas and to utilize those fuel breaks to do things like light a backfire. If they need to go in and start prepping just to make it safe to be there, of course, that's an incredible amount of lost time. But of course, anything that you do proactively in terms of putting in a fuel break or doing some type of fuel treatment that's intended to address the spread of wildfire is only going to be effective in the scenario that you're contemplating, where you have an ignition at a particular point in space and then the fire is moving in a particular way. Of course, it could be a little bit to the north or a little bit to the south, and it could go around what you're doing. So it's really, there's always that caveat of that's only going to be effective in a certain suite of circumstances. Next slide. So then the separate question of what we can do to enhance ecosystem health. And this is really where prescribed burning and cultural burning come into play. There are instances where you can do a prescribed burn that's strategic, that is intended to enhance community safety if it's, say, directly adjacent to a road where you're trying to minimize the potential for ignitions from the roadway, or if it's around, you know, a structure or a school or something like that. But generally, prescribed burning on the wildlands, these things that we undertake away from communities, their objectives and the effectiveness that they're going to have is entirely, almost entirely focused on the health of those places and making those places resilient to the passage of future wildfires, as well as climate shifts and other extreme events. So prescribed burning, of course, is kind of in some cases the gold standard for being able to reset some of these areas to a healthier state. When you can't burn, or when you can't burn yet because you have too much fuel in the system, then targeted understory thinning can be incredibly effective, either as a prep before you burn or as a surrogate for burning in an area where it's not going to be appropriate to put fire on the ground due to defensibility issues or adjacency to somebody's home. And then sensitive post-fire actions. And I say sensitive because many, many landowners reach out to me immediately after a fire, all fired up and saying, what do I need to do? I need to put everything back. I need to fix everything. I need to go out there and seed and do a bunch of stuff. And really you don't. As we've mentioned, invasive species control is something that you need to think about. Soil protection and erosion mitigation can be of concern in the immediate post-fire environment if you have burned structures with potentially toxic material that could run off into waterways or wetland systems. If you have significant burned areas along creek banks or other drainages, that sort of thing. And then also being mindful of protecting the soil in its post-fire state, which is a little bit different than thinking about erosion mitigation. But after a fire, soil has, of course, been impacted by that fire. It may have lost organic material. It may be kind of puffy feeling if you walk across it. And that's because there are now air pockets where there used to be organic material forming part of that soil structure. So soils tend to be really fragile after fires, and it's a really good idea not to drive on them or put equipment on them or drag things across them. And I even kind of tiptoe across them when I have to walk on them, because it takes a long time to build soil, and it can take a moment to set yourself back by 1,000 years. Hazard tree removal, of course, is something that we all have to deal with, often immediately post-fire if there are trees that pose a threat to life and property. And then supporting natural regeneration and species compositional shifts. That may be as simple as staying out of an area and taking kind of a wait and see approach rather than reseeding. Give it a year and see what happens in terms of natural regeneration. And allow things to change if it makes sense, if it's something that you can accommodate. In ecology and biology, we talk a lot about, in the face of climate change, that individual plant species as well as plant communities are going to need to move, to go, potentially up in elevation or to shift around to the north side of a slope to find conditions where they can continue to thrive as conditions are changing. Just like us, plants can only move into available real estate, really. So if you have an area that's fully occupied by Douglas fir forest, a bunch of oaks aren't going to suddenly start utilizing that area because it's good habitat for them. So if you do have disturbance, you do have suddenly areas where soil and sunlight and nutrient availability is there for the taking. You may have other species coming in, and that may be what the land needs. And so reminding people to be thoughtful and to be patient and to be accommodating of that, unless there's some compelling reason not to be, is something that we can really do to kind of contemplate what's coming down the pike with climate change and support ecosystem health. Next slide. So if I just had a few takeaways from this to share with everybody, just really want to emphasize that where it comes to fire safety, home hardening and defensible space is by far the most effective way to protect structures, protect people's investments, to protect infrastructure. That is the answer. And it does seem that within our community, even though we've been banging that drum a great deal in recent years, the emphasis really does seem to be on that sense of, well, the danger is out there and the solution is out there far from me, and the responsibility is out there far from me. So really all of us who live in a house and live in a community and have neighbors have responsibilities in terms of making our own homes fire safe, and understanding that if our homes catch fire, they are going to become the fuel that catches the next house downwind on fire as well. That the land stewardship that we undertake pre and post fire, it really needs to be nuanced and site and objective specific. Everybody wants to know, well, what is the thing that you do in this habitat type? And it really is going to depend on the site and the specifics of that site and how that site has been used potentially well into the past. And then also just to keep the lines of communication open and to share and to continue to learn from one another. We're in very novel circumstances right now, and we can look to the past and we can look to our Indigenous partners for incredible wisdom as to what these lands have been like and how we can steward them. But we've never been in a situation now where we have wholesale habitat shifts and climate change and drought and just a suite of circumstances that nobody has all of the answers to. No one agency or organization, no individual is the final arbiter of what we ought to be doing. And we're going to have to try some things and learn and keep those discussions going. So that's really what I hope that people will continue to do. And I think the last slide is just for questions and discussion.